Hello, I'm Matthew Gnagy, and this is the Modern Maker Workroom. I'm so glad to have you here today, and we're going to talk about making this cable knit sweater vest. Now, I really don't like to put out patterns per se, so we're really going to talk about methods, because I'm assuming people that know how to knit and want to make something like this can figure out their cables and choose their own design, but we really want to think about how we put the whole thing together, how we conceptualize the fit, how we conceptualize the stitch density, and all of the things that go with that. So I hope you'll join me on this little journey to make a cottage core style sweater vest. I'm Matthew Nagy, and this is the Modern Maker Workroom. For starters, I want to talk about the fact that the yarn for this vest is hand spun. Now, I made this using this particular blend called Spice that comes from Kramer yarns. Now, the roving style is called Mock Chunky, and the content is 100% American wool. Now, I spun this using my electric spinning wheel. This one comes from Hands and Crafts. It is a really good spinning wheel. I absolutely love working on it, and I've spun a variety of yarns. This yarn I spun as a fine singles and then plied it back on itself to create a 3-ply yarn. Now the end result is a yarn that is approximately like a DK weight, maybe slightly lighter, but it's pretty lofty, so it compresses down really well when it's knit. And that's something that I really like because that gives me the opportunity to create a really dense fabric, and it's actually quite easy to knit with. If the yarn was a little bit more dense, it would make it actually harder to knit a dense fabric because you have to pull so much harder to create the right tension. When I begin a knitting process, I usually do so with a little sketch of the most complicated part of the sweater and kind of roughing in where I want the designs to be. Now this is specific to my process for developing a cable knit sweater, and so you can see my basic design concept where the pattern is centered on the body, and then below you can see my just really chicken scratch version of counting out the different cables and the divider stitches so that I can figure out how many stitches I actually need. Now, once I'd figured out the knit itself, I actually did a gauge swatch and figured out what I wanted in terms of density so that I could figure out the number of stitches per inch. I don't really pay attention to number of rows per inch because, especially with cables, I tend to measure according to the pattern repeat and then just measure directly with a tape measure. So in order to do that well, I decide how long the garment is going to be, whether I want it to stretch onto the body or whether I want it to sit relaxed on the body, and from there I make my pattern diagram. Now this is a step that a lot of people skip, and I think that it's an indispensable step in developing a sweater. Because I teach a lot of pattern making, and I think it's important for people to understand really what they're doing instead of guessing about it as they go. The pattern making process to create this diagram makes a lot of sense to my brain. So as I work through it, I decide how long it's going to be, and frequently I'll just measure on my body, kind of where do I want it to hit? What's the measurement from the neck to the hem? What's the measurement across the shoulder? And I take all these measurements and I write them down, and then I draw a little diagram like this. If I am doubtful of what I have created, then very often I will make some kind of mock-up. When it comes to sweaters, a lot of times I'll do that in like a cheapo sweatshirt fabric just to make sure that I've got something that behaves the way I want it to behave. And my original intention was for this sweater vest to have pockets, but I actually ran out of yarn and didn't have the energy to spin more. That's actually why I don't have a swatch to show you, is because I needed the yarn. So I ripped the swatch out and used it for some of the knitting. I literally only had the tiniest handful of yarn left over when I was done. And to me, that's a pretty perfectly measured project that I got it exactly out of 1 pound of wool. Now, I like a really professional start to my knitting, and I think that just comes from so many years of working in the fashion industry, knitting things for runway shows. but I really like a tubular cast on when I'm doing a 1 by 1 rib. So this cast on is made by twining the front yarn and the back yarn together so that you have structurally you have knits and purls. And what this does is there's a secondary technique that comes in the first 2 rows that enables you to create a hollow tubular edge at the very bottom of the ribbing. And when you do this, the ribbing has this illusion of rolling right around the edge and up the other side, so you have no distinct cast-on stitches. It's really quite invisible. It is also known as an invisible cast-on, but it is specifically for 1 by 1 rib. On the very last stitch, which in this case is a purl, I want to make sure that I create a stitch that locks. So I'm going to grab here and I'm going to pull this like a purl stitch. I'm going to grab the loop in front and pull it through as though I were making a purl, and then tighten down this little stitch right at the end. And that gives me a stitch at the front that is locked. Then I'm going to turn around and I'm going to begin working my first 2 rows, which are worked exactly the same, but they're done in a special way. I'm going to knit my first stitch, and then I'm going to slip my second stitch with the yarn in front, and then I'm going to knit the next one. So I do this for 2 rows, slipping the purls with the yarn in front and knitting the knit stitches so that I am working just half the stitches with each pass. Now I'm only going to do this for 2 rows. If I do this for more than 2 rows, then I actually end up pulling a little bit too much up in the take up with the rib because I'm essentially using a double knitting technique. But the double knit works well for just these first 2 rows. It spreads the stitches out evenly, it gives a really nice elastic edge, and it looks fantastic and professional on the finished garment. You really get into the swing of it too. I find these first 2 rows to go quite quickly, even when I'm working on very small needles. In this case, I'm working the ribbing on a size 1 knitting needle, and that makes for a tight, firm ribbing. Now, that means that I've had to increase the number of stitches for the ribbing, and then when I get to the main body, I'm going to decrease as I work that. But what it means is I get this really nice, firm, kind of full-bodied rib that really looks professional and has a very vintage feel to it instead of the kind of chunky ribbings that we do today. This ends up looking quite fine and tight and beautiful. Another thing that I do to create a really professional look and give the cables a good clean start is the first wrong side row after the ribbing, which is where I decrease the number of stitches to match what I need to do the cables. I will just, it's a wrong side row, so I'll purl completely across the row while I decrease. And this creates a little bit of a divot that has a clean dividing line between the ribbing and the cable work. And you can see it here from the back side that it's just a plain purl row across everything. And this really just helps me get a fresh, tidy beginning to the cables. I'm well past the ribbing at this point and deep into the main body of stitches. Now I really want to show this to you at full speed because I want people to understand that this kind of skill comes from practice. It doesn't really matter if you're working in continental or English style knitting, whether you're throwing or whether you're picking like I do. What you need to do is you need to find where you waste your energy and minimize that wasted energy. You see that my motions are kept quite small with my needles and they're kept quite quick. And as I work, I'm reading the fabric as I go to know where my knits and purls belong. And sometimes you'll see me pause just in case I get it wrong. But generally speaking, I'm reading the bumps of the purl stitches and the V shapes of the knit stitches as I work across, and just double checking that I did everything correctly on the previous row. The majority of the instructions in this video are really about the fronts of the garment because there's so much detail going on, but really you should knit the back of the sweater first. It's the biggest piece, you have the most motivation at the beginning, and you really need the measurements of the back in order to create the front accurately. With that wrong side row completed, I am going to commence the next right side row. But before I do, I want to show you, I'm using a 1x1 rib at the center front of this sweater vest to work like a cardigan style front opening. If I were to do these stitches in the same size needle, they would end up stretching out and having kind of a sloppy fluted edge. So in order to keep them tight, I'm just over these 9 stitches that I have for the center front, I'm using this much smaller needle to knit the ribbing so that it stays tight, so that it doesn't get loose and doesn't stretch out over time. I pull out of the way, I grab the opposite end of the main needle, and then I continue with the cable section. Now what you'll see here also is that I don't use a cable needle. And this is an important technique, I think, for building up speed and confidence. So you see here for this 2-stitch cable, I just stick the needle through the second stitch first and knit it, and then I'll do my 2 purls. And then I'll do it again because I have 2 of those in a row, right? So I just knit the second one first, first one second, and now I'm going to turn the 6-stitch cable here. I insert my needle 3/3, and then I will grab the stitches and then reinsert the needle into those 3. And depending on whether I have a right turning cable or a left turning cable, I will pick up the stitches either in front or in back. It really depends on how you're turning. So I split my yarn, so I had to fix this stitch here. There's better. All right, so now those 6-stitch cable is complete, and I've got my 2 purls. I'm going to do another 2-stitch twist. So 1, 2, there we go, 2 purls, and another stitch twist. This is actually a resting row for the Aran diamond that goes in the middle. So I'm just going to work my way across these stitches, reading them as they are. I have moss stitch in the middle, so I'm going to knit the purls and purl the knits across the center of the diamond. And then I have 2 stitches flanking the diamond shape on each side, plus 2 purls between them to create a border for the cable panel. Now I'm back to the far side here, and you see me do my 2-stitch cable really fast, a couple of purls. What I'm trying to do here, I'm not trying to wow anyone with my speed, but I am trying to demonstrate a, and this is not as fast as it could be, but I'm trying to demonstrate sort of a professional working speed. Like if I were knitting something for a runway show, this is probably the slowest that I would be working. I'm trying to move carefully for the camera, etc. But if I were really going full tilt to be able to produce something for a runway show and make the most money possible, I would be working really, really fast. Now, that has some diminishing returns depending on how nimble your fingers are, but it's important to remember that the speed with which we're taught to knit is very much for leisure craft. And if you're going to turn it into a profession, there's a certain amount of speed trial that you have to work on with yourself in order to get to a place where you can work quickly and accurately. So I have reached the bottom of the armhole, so I have to do the bind off for the bottom of the armhole. I wanted to show you this because I want you to understand that as you're binding off, particularly as you're working with a cable, there are decreases that have to be made as you are working along. So wherever I have a 2-stitch cable, I'm going to bind those stitches off together by actually purling them together and then working the past the first stitch over motion with the bind off. And what this does is it helps keep the fabric from expanding awkwardly because cables have take-up in them, and you add extra cables. You hear I'm purling those 2 together. You add extra stitches to your cables so that you have that relief because there's a sort of a bind behind them as the stitches cross. They lift up off of the surface and they create a corrugated dimensionality. You have to be aware of that as you're binding off for the bottom of the armhole or decreasing for a shoulder. Anytime you're shaping, it's usually about you're decreasing 1 stitch for every 3. So where I have a 2-stitch cable, I'm working those 2 stitches together as 1. Where I have a 6-stitch cable, like a 3/3, then I will decrease each side from 3 stitches to 2 stitches as I bind off, and that helps close the tension in at the top of the cable to prevent the edge from flaring out and causing a poor fit or visual disturbance. At the same level of the armhole is where I begin the shaping for the center front neckline because I want it to be a V-neck cardigan style vest front. And in order to get that ribbing that I have going up center front to turn properly and follow along the decreased edge, I need to do a couple of short rows so that my turn isn't overly tight. And this is really important. Now, I don't need to do too many of them. I'm only doing 2 sets of short rows just to get it to turn at an angle. But you can see that I knit all the way to the end with the rib, and then I turn, and I'm going to go about halfway across my ribbing stitches, and then I'm going to do a wrap and turn motion, usually on a knit stitch because it's easier. There we go. So I'm going to wrap and turn here. I'm going to pull the yarn in front, I'm going to slip it off, put the yarn to the back, and then slip the stitch back on the needle, and then turn and finish off the row. And then I'm going to do that again. So now that I'm at the end, I'm turning back around, and I'm going to work those stitches again. Then I'm going to pick up the wrap and stick it on the needle and then work those two together as though I'm doing a decrease. So I pick the wrap up from the base of the wrapped stitch and then work it like a decrease, and that helps keep the hole from forming. So then I get to this place, I'm wrapping and turning again, and I'm at the actual very edge of the ribbing, and then I'm going to finish the ribbing once more and then go back across, and then I'll proceed with the rest of the row. But this just helps create a little angle right there at the top of the center front edge so that the ribbing can just turn and follow along the edge of the neck shaping without me having to shape within the ribbing. This just becomes then a ribbed trim that flows right along with the knitting. It's all knit as one as part of the front. A lot of the old vintage patterns will actually have you knit this separately and seam it on later. And I find that to be very time consuming, and I don't think I get as clean of a ribbing when I do it that way. Now, most patterns have you knit the back of a garment first, and this one is no different. I absolutely knit the back of this sweater vest first, and that way I know what the measurement of the back neckline is. So when I completed this front, I just continued the ribbing at center front off as an extension off of the shoulder so that it can just cross halfway across the back neck. Now I'll do the same thing on the other front, and then I can join them at center back with, well, I'm just going to use a 3-needle bind off, but you could graft, you could do whatever you want. I think it's nice to see a little seam there, so I like the 3-needle bind off technique. Now this sweater vest has the buttonholes are on the left and the buttons are on the right. And in order to put the buttonholes in the button band, I need to do a buttonhole. So I'm going to show you what is known as a 1-row buttonhole, even though for me technically I call it a 2-row buttonhole. But it's quite simple, and it's very much a lace knitting technique. So here I'm going to work 2 stitches together. I'm going to purl 2 stitches together here. I'm going to wrap the yarn twice around the needle, and then I'm going to knit 2 together on the other side of it. So I've decreased 2 stitches and then used 2 wraps in their place, just as though I were doing a complex piece of lace knitting. Now I'm going to do that a second time in this sample, just so that you can see it happen again. And here we go. I'm going to knit 2 together, pardon me, purl 2 together here, and then wrap twice, and then knit 2 together here. The purl 2, wrap twice, knit 2 together, that really helps me keep the ribbing pattern consistent so that when I come across the back side of the row, it doesn't look as good on the back side, but regardless, the front will look perfectly fine. There's just one little purl bump where I don't want it to be, but it's sort of unavoidable. So I'm going to knit, purl, and as I approach the double wrap, what happens here is that I will knit and purl into the same wrap. So it's a long wrap, so I'm going to take 2 stitches in it. I'm going to knit one, and then I'm going to purl one into that wrap, and then I'm just going to proceed with the rest of the ribbing as standard, right? Just knit the knits and purl the purls. I'm going to show you that again at the second buttonhole. As we come up to it, just look really carefully at how I slip the first half of the double wrap off the needle as I change to the purl. So I've knit this when I've got half the wrap off, I purl that one, and then I continue on. The very next row is going to be perfectly normal. I just knit, purl, knit one, purl one across the entire row, and suddenly I have these beautiful buttonholes in the middle of my knitting. So I do these on the sweater vest front, and it creates just the right size. I probably could have knit a little bit looser or used a slightly smaller button than my finished project, but regardless, I have a nice tight buttonhole that's not prone to stretching out. The double wrap gives a lot of structure, I think, which over the long term makes me a little bit happier with how the buttonhole ages. I could do a more substantial buttonhole that's easier to button now, but over time, that buttonhole is going to stretch out. I would rather the buttonhole be easier to manage in a year or two than to have it stretch completely out of shape for the entire life of the garment. At this point in the process, all the major knitting is complete. The back is done because it's the first thing I did. The fronts are complete, and I have now joined the center back neck. The little extensions have been joined so that I have a center back neck. So my next task is going to be to start assembling the sweater vest, and I usually do that with a crochet hook in a process that is called linking. That's a normal industry name for crocheting things together in a very tidy way. Linking is it's a very normal industrial process. A lot of hand knitters like to very carefully graft things together, but I find that that's essentially a running stitch and it's not very stretchy. And while it creates an invisible seam, it's not very strong. And I like to know that my garments can be put through the wringer and not really destroyed with average wear. Now we begin the somewhat fiddly process of using a chain stitch to put the sweater pieces together. Now I'm using a normal crochet hook and the same yarn that I used to knit the thing. I start with a slip knot and then I put the hook through the corners that begin my seam, and then I pull through and make a little chain, and then all I do is put the stitch through the next set of loops and continue to work. Now you'll see how I tilt the crochet hook up before taking the chain, and a lot of people when they take the chain they'll pull the hook straight back because it's easier to pull the crook through the stitch, but what happens then is you end up with something that's really tight, and your seam will actually shrink up because you're pulling so much tension in the chain stitch. This way I can keep the stitches organized and even and somewhat loose so that that elasticity of the chain stitch continues to lend itself nicely to the way the garment is worn. I'll continue this chain stitch right through just the edge of the pieces that need to be sewn together, and I'll continue it right up to where the collar pieces, the little extensions, start hanging off the front. And that should match up perfectly with the neckline corner of my backs, which it does. And I take one stitch there, and then I'll proceed my way across the back neckline and then down the other shoulder. Now, something that I want to make sure I remember to tell you here is that I'm trying to take as little of this ribbed strip as possible because it's quite narrow and I don't want to lose too much of it into the seam itself. So I'm really only taking just one strand of yarn from the edge of the band, and then I'm taking 2 loops, the 2 kind of legs of the bound off stitches across the back neckline. And I'll proceed like this, constantly checking to see that the center back seam of the neck extensions matches the center of the diamond that's at center back of the garment. And when I've completed with going across the back neck, then I'll just continue right down the other shoulder until it's done. Once those seams are sewn, I'm going to go to the iron and I'm going to use a lot of steam and a little bit of pressure to squash those seams down to create slightly less bulk. I'm just going to press those seams a little bit just right where they are, just to crush the yarn in place and to lock the chain stitch into its form. To finish the armholes, I'm going to use some garter bands, which means I knit every row. And to begin with, I will pick up stitches along the armhole. Now, I don't really count, especially when it's this style, and I leave the side open so that I can just pick up evenly. And there is a pattern to the picking up of the stitches. You pick up 2 stitches, one in each loop, and then you skip a stitch, and then you pick up 3, and then you skip a stitch and pick up 2, and then skip a stitch and pick up 3. This gives you a nice even number of stitches that fits the stretchiness of the edge. If you try to pick up a stitch in every single stitch along the edge of the knitting, you'll end up with too many and your armhole edging will flute out and it'll look really unattractive. So to avoid that, we use this 2 skip 3 skip 2 skip 3 process. Once I have all of those stitches picked up, then I will knit 8 rows in garter stitch, and that leaves me 4 purl wales on the outside, and I will bind off in knit stitch on the wrong side of my last row. So the last row is going to be a purl bump on the outside because it's a knit row on the wrong side of the work, and as I'm knitting that, I will bind off so that I have a nice clean finish on the exterior edge of the armhole. Once that armhole is knit, then I will close the side seams of the vest and hide all of the ends.